any advice for people who are talking to friends and family who are unsure, undecided, or skeptical of vaccines and how they can approach that? Any tips for someone who's trying to be that messenger and isn't quite sure how to approach it? Dr. Richardson, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I think I'm very clear, because particularly in some communities, as I've said, things have been forced upon us. So it's really important that people understand that they need to make informed choices and decisions. And what does one mean to make an informed choice? One needs to actually understand. And so doing the work of learning, of understanding, first of all, the regulatory process that Dr. Sharma described, the incredible science that's gone into vaccine development that Dr. Gomerman described, and being able to share how all of this has been done in a really rigorous way is important, and allowing people to be able to make those informed choices. Number two is that I actually have had the sadness of seeing how this illness affects people in the real world setting. Some people many who are young, who are in the ICU now, who are not going to recover, seeing the experience of that is absolutely devastating. And to think about that occurring to any person I love, any person I work with, is actually terrible. And so to be able to actually share, for people to understand the impacts, not only of having severe illness or that leads to hospitalization or, heaven forbid, death, but also long COVID, which we're now seeing emerge, which are the long-term complications of this condition, where people are not recovering for months and months and months, and there are many manifestations of that. I also share that. And I share it not in a threatening way, just in this is what I have had, what I have been exposed to in my day-to-day life, caring for people with this condition. And I want others to be aware of that.
Thank you so much. Just remembering that it's really about caring, and it's about not wanting harm to be done to the people that we love. Sometimes we get caught up in sharing the numbers and the percentages and the details, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, approaching those conversations with concern and care, I think, as you've just described, goes such a long way. Dr. Gomerman or Sharma, anything to add on that note?
Yeah, so I agree with Dr. Richardson. You kind of have to meet people where they are, right? And people have their own personal reasons for being hesitant to take a vaccine. And so just to jump all over them is never that effective. But one thing that I do explain, which I think has helped, is that, one thing I hear a lot of is, well, wouldn't it be better if I got the natural infection? Wouldn't my immune response be stronger than getting this artificial thing? Well, there's a lot of data that says, first of all, the immune response to SARS-CoV-2 is highly variable. The measurements that that have been made for both the B cell and T cell response show a variability of about 200-fold. So that's a big range, and you don't know where you're going to end up on that range. And we know that there are mutations in the general outbred population that can really tip that balance towards you getting a really severe case of COVID-19 or getting long COVID. So that's a bit of a roll of the dice. And then secondly, there's new data emerging that shows that people who are pre-immune due to the infection make a pretty wimpy response to some of the variants. But then when they get the vaccine, boom, that goes way up. And that's because the vaccine is really focused on that one spike protein. So you're getting a really intelligent immune response to the virus. And so I explain the benefits of vaccination from an immunological point of view as simply as I can. And I think, and I probably don't even have to be simple. I think people really want to understand how this works. And that often helps too. But you got to meet people where they are.
And maybe to add, as much as we need to look at this on a population basis from public health perspective, in the 30,000-foot view, what it comes down to is individuals. And individuals are just that, individual. They have their own risk tolerance, they have their own circumstances. And so there's a few things that, I think some great points have already been made, so I won't restate them, but there's a few things that I think when I'm having conversations with people that's helpful to keep in mind. One is that people are not, if they're hesitant or if they're not confident, they're not doing it out of malice. They're doing it because they want to make a good decision for themselves and for people that they care about, right? So I think sometimes we, when people are either shaming people into it or being critical, saying it's a no-brainer, you should just want to get vaccinated, I think that immediately turns people off. So first part of it is starting the conversation from a point of being open. And then the other question that I find useful to kind of put out there is, what would it take for you to get to a yes? Right? Because it's amazing when you open that conversation what it is. Sometimes it's, well, I want more people to get vaccinated. I want some time to go by before, it's not an absolute no. It's like, I would like to see what happens. Or it's like, it's a specific thing, right? Like, I think I might be able to get the disease from the vaccine. So as you kind of have those conversations, then you can figure out what it is that's actually motivating people. Sometimes it's just that it's not available to them. It's difficult to get to. So I think you have to kind of take that on. And because at Health Canada we are by nature working at the 30,000 foot level, our part of our and the work in the public health agency as well is equipping other people to have those conversations. We know that people trust people that they know, that they're in their personal space. They're healthcare practitioners. They're religious leaders in the community, other thought leaders, family members. So put the buffet of information out there. People can take from it what they need to be able to have those conversations and equip people to make those empowered decisions for themselves. Of course, knowing what we know, we want that decision to be a yes, that, we think that everyone should be getting vaccinated and as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. But people will only, even the most effective vaccine on the planet is only effective if somebody trusts it and agrees to take it.
Vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do.
There we go.